Hey guys, I haven't made a video in a while. As I've mentioned before, I am a graphic designer for my day job. And lately in the graphic design world, there's been a lot of criticism popping up about a particular art style. Over the past few years, there's been a trend of illustrative design that tends to involve the same sorts of flat, brightly colored characters doing similar things rendered similarly. It's so popular that even if you're not a designer, you're probably familiar with it. It's currently the go-to aesthetic for corporations, including Google and Facebook, for example. It's so common, in fact, that people have just started calling it the corporate art style. So recently, a YouTuber named Solar Sands released a video titled, "Why Do Corporate Art Styles Feel Fake?" wherein he criticizes this style to basically unanimous agreement. It looks like people have really started to resent these oddly proportioned, colorful little people. In the video, he refers to this style as being aggressively happy and people-pleasing, having forced smiles that seem to say, "Trust us," and not accurately representing the corporations they're illustrated for. Which is all true. This style has become incredibly generic. Absolutely. But he eventually comes to this conclusion that suggests that if it were not for this art style and the demand for it from corporations, we'd be experiencing a wide array of innovative art styles in our advertisements.
I would prefer if the internet was designed with diverse art styles and innovation, but that's probably not going to happen until this kind of graphic design's appeal truly starts to wear off on the majority of its target audience.
And this is where I know that he's mistaken. The idea that this corporate art style is holding back a torrent of corporate creative expression, it's just such a misunderstanding of what's happening, and I'll explain why. So one thing that always seems to get left out of these design trend conversations is the distinction between a designer and an illustrator. See, some designers can illustrate at a variety of different skill levels, and even less illustrators can design. But by no means can you assume that a designer is able to even do illustration work. In the past few years, the line between designer and illustrator has been getting blurrier, and it's becoming much more normal for clients to expect a designer to know how to illustrate. But frankly, illustration is an entirely different ballgame than design. They're two separate skills. Design is concerned with layout, grid systems, colors and shape, typography and alignment, making a product that's easy to use. It's very technical. Illustration tends to be less technical and more aesthetic. It's about representation, evoking an emotion, telling a story. Expecting a designer to do an illustrator's job is usually going to result in subpar work, and reasonably so. Most illustrators I know have been drawing since they were little kids. They have complex understandings of perspective and anatomy, wide pools of references and inspiration they've spent decades learning from. Most of them have been to art school specifically for illustration. They've done life drawing, learned to render realistically, and then pivoted to a signature style of their own. Alternatively, designers work more in composition, form, and shapes. They can manipulate these things to sort of design an illustration, but they rarely have a solid understanding of human anatomy or perspective or even light and shadow. And this corporate art style we're criticizing for being generic and soulless is the result of designers doing their absolute best to work with the skills that they have, because the industry now expects illustration work from them. They're learning to illustrate on tight budgets and tight timelines. So of course these illustrations are not wildly impressive in the way that we know illustrations can be. They're not made by illustrators. Solar Sands even admits in his video that these illustrations are not badly designed. He says they're simple, easily scalable, easy to animate, easy to replicate, and can be modified faster and more easily than traditional mediums. And this is all true. If you're working as a graphic designer on a corporate job, most of which are not willing to hire a full-time illustrator, you have to manage a lot of assets and create a lot of work. All the while, that work is going through constant revisions. This corporate style is flexible to match that. It lets you save time. You can switch out details, colors, you can modify how the people look and what they're doing. It's really the only feasible style designers can manage under the constant revisions of a typical project. The idea that if it weren't for this style imposed on us by corporations, everyone would be creating innovative, varying work is laughable. Before this style was invented, we didn't have this amazing array of different art styles in corporate advertisements. What we had was pretty much no illustrations, because designers aren't illustrators. When this style first popped up 3 or 4 years ago, everyone actually loved it because it was bringing a lot of color and energy to designs that were cold and sterile. This art style isn't obscuring better illustrations. Without it, there's literally nothing. If a corporation wants to brand themselves with a unique and innovative illustration style, what they need to do is hire a dedicated illustrator. And that illustrator needs to be hired based on their style fitting the brief. Not hiring just any illustrator and asking them to change their style to fit the brief. Because another misconception about illustrators is that they can just work in any old style you pay them to work in. Illustrators work actually much more like fine artists. They spend years honing in on a specific aesthetic. They get known for their style, and then they get hired to work in that style. You don't hire Picasso and ask him to paint a Rembrandt. It's not going to look right. Designers, on the other hand, are often expected to adapt to suit the client, which is fine when it comes to strict design work. You can manipulate typography and shapes and layouts to evoke, a lot of different aesthetics. But you cannot expect that same type of adaptability when it comes to illustration work, because illustration styles can take years of study to be able to be executed effectively. And I think, maybe without realizing it, executing work at the level of a fine artist is actually what critics of this corporate art style are asking designers to do. As a designer that illustrates myself, I'm pretty frequently asked to change up my style to suit a project. And a critique I often get is that the style I'm using is too similar to styles I've done in the past. But, well, of course it's similar. I made it. You're going to have a hard time finding an illustrator whose work varies so much from piece to piece that you can't recognize it's by the same person. There's always going to be decisions that tie them together. Solar Sans ends the video with examples of what he considers to be good examples of flat or geometric design work. And I can only assume this is insinuating this is the level of quality designers should be striving for. But of course a random designer's work doesn't compare to A.M. Cassandra. They're a famous historic illustrator whose work has lasted in the public consciousness for 100 years. The designers we're talking about are making $20 an hour working on a rich kid's startup project. I've been a designer professionally for a dozen years now, and it's always bothered me how designers talk about their own work in the industry. The discussions always seem to be in service of capitalism and not in service of themselves. It's always about how to be as productive as possible, how to be as original as possible, as innovative as possible, how to maximize your spare time to improve your skills, all for the benefit of making more money for your employer. Most industries have kind of gotten over this hustle culture in the past 10 years. I think it's time for design to catch up. I mean, so much of what I hear designers say feels like some kind of capitalism brain rot to me. Like criticizing this art style for feeling fake or for not having soul. Why are we expecting corporations to have work at the level of stimulating fine art? Why are you looking for soul in an illustration on a Facebook birthday notification? It just feels strange, right now specifically, to be criticizing designers for making work that's good, but not great on the level of fine art. We've all spent the last year isolated, kept away from our loved ones, barely holding on to our sanity, all the while being expected to work at the same level of productivity we always have. People are getting poorer and corporations are getting richer, and our internal discussions are about how we can force ourselves to learn in a few months what illustrators spend their entire lives learning in order to make illustrations for Google so that Google can have soul. It's something to think about. Bye.